Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on how we can achieve the best social impact out of the minimum energy performance standards that we expect the Commission to propose at the end of this year. I'm welcoming you all. We have some excellent panelists today that I'm really excited. I've been very much looking forward to this session, really excited to hear from. Handing over to our hosts today, ECF, who've organised this webinar, to René Bruel, just for a short introduction to the session. René.
Thank you, Louise, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you here for this webinar. I'd like to welcome you on how to introduce, and this webinar on how to introduce minimum energy performance standards in a socially just way on behalf of the European Climate Foundation. My name is René Bruel and I lead the buildings program at ECF. And I'll just do a 2-minute introduction and then hand it back over to Louise, who's your moderator of today. And I know that we're all waiting quite anxiously for the first batch of proposals in the Fit for 55 package that will be presented next week. And many of these proposals are relevant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector. But later this year, we'll see the publication of a second set of proposals from the Fit for 55 package, and among which is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directives. And one of the key measures we expect to be included in the EPBD is a minimum energy performance standard for existing buildings. And we all know that existing buildings are the most challenging part of the building sector to decarbonize. And therefore, at ECF, we've supported several pieces of research into what role minimum energy performance standards can play to support an increase in building renovation rates and how they can be designed in the context of the EPBD. And it's very clear that we need to be aware of the impact on households and make sure that such an instrument is introduced in a socially just way. And because this is where the energy transition gets really close to citizens. And that's what this webinar is about. So I'm very honored to see that we have such outstanding speakers today. There will be 2 panels in this webinar. And first will be about what can be done at European level to ensure that MEPS delivers social benefits for all households, in addition to greenhouse gas emission reduction, of course. And in the second panel, we'll zoom in on current experiences with MEPS and opportunities and challenges to implement MEPS at national level. I'll now hand back over to Louise, and I wish you a very good webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, René. Indeed, we have these 2 excellent panels of speakers. I will introduce the first panel to be looking at the overarching EU framework in a moment. A few pieces of admin. Please feel free to share any thoughts, experiences from your country, suggestions of solutions. Today is all about solutions. So please feel free to share those thoughts in the chat. And any questions for the 2 panels, please use the Q&A. And we are recording the session, as I'm sure you've already seen. So first, now to introduce our wonderful first panel. We have representatives of the really key stakeholder groups of building owners from both the private and social sectors, tenants, and also representing some of the most vulnerable, those with insecure housing and homelessness issues in our communities. So we have Anna Compacha from FIANSA, the European Federation of National Organisations working with the homeless. We have Barbara Steinbergen from the International Union of Tenants. We have Emmanuel Kos from the International Union of Property Owners, and Julian Dijol from Housing Europe, the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing. Anna, turning to you first, I read recently a really interesting blog that you wrote for Directive, which outlined actually a range of solutions that you've come to from the FIANSA point of view. I wonder if you could kick us off by providing that bit of an overview.
Yes, thank you very much. So yeah, with FIANSA, together with the Fondation Abbé Pierre, every year we do an overview of housing exclusion in Europe. And there we can see that there are 1 in 5 households in the EU, or 15% of Europeans, that live in unfit housing. And in addition to that, we have 50 million households that live in energy poverty. And in this context, it will be crucial that MEPS and the renovation wave overall will be designed and implemented in a way that these can prioritize these vulnerable groups. For that, we need really strong social safeguards, and really the first one that I would like to highlight is the prioritization of energy poor and low income households. And that can be done by giving a good definition within the EPBD of worst performing buildings. So worst performing buildings should not be limited to energy efficiency, but also include unhealthy and inadequate housing conditions, such as moldy, damp, and cold houses with leaky roofs. And also marginalized groups that live in unofficial settlements that by being prioritized could get the possibility to live in adequate housing. We can see that with energy retrofits, there's not always energy performance gains that are sufficient to cover the costs of renovation, and especially for vulnerable groups that live in so-called cold homes, so that don't even use cooling or heating because they cannot afford it. A retrofit will not give them sufficient money savings, so that loans or on-bill financing schemes are not always the best solution. So here it will be crucial that the EU, but also national level, give adequate funding for the renovation of these worst performing buildings of the most vulnerable. And from what we hear now, from that there's the possibility of a climate action social facility that will be put forward, we are very worried that this will be designed in a way to only counter the negative effects of the ETS extension to buildings that will maybe come, and so will be something that comes ex post. But we rather argue that we need ex ante design of MEPS that really takes into account those who are living in the most inadequate housing situations. The EU, in addition to the funding, of course, can also play a very important role in helping member states setting up technical and practical assistance to energy poor when they renovate. And this can be done by setting up holistic one-stop shops. And just to finish my intervention, I want to give an example of best practice. That is something that you can do, best practice sharing. The Toi d'abord program of the Fondation Abbé Pierre in France, which is a program where there has been a renovation of homes that are owned by local nonprofit associations, and to provide affordable and energy efficient housing for lower income households. There's the objective to upgrade houses that are generally class E, F, and G to housing A, B, C class. And like this, since many years now already, there are 600 dwellings per year that are upgraded and giving 900 to 1,200 people energy efficient and adequate house. And I think this is a solution that should be very much put forward. And if you want more, we have written a report that's called Targeting Energy Efficient Innovation to Improve Housing Conditions for the Most Vulnerable. It will be shared in the chat. There you have other examples, like the one I've been talking to. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, and we'll share that link in the chat. That really is a very good and inspiring report on some of the solutions that are available. And that really, I think the key point there, and Anna, I know we've spoken about this before, is that those solutions really need to be scaled up. You know, at the moment, a lot of them are small examples, excellent examples, but really we need to see them in more places and affecting more lives across Europe. So moving now to Barbara. I think tenants, it goes without saying, you know, tenants will need to be one of the key focuses of our social safeguards to ensure that tenancies remain secure and that rents remain affordable. I wonder if you could outline some of your thinking on the specific safeguards needed for tenants and highlight any good examples that you would like to see replicated.
Thank you, Louise. With pleasure. Yes, my name is Barbara Steenbergen, representing in this wonderful panel the International Union of Tenants. We represent 1/3 of the population of Europe, those who rent. And in total, we have 20 million organized tenants in our union. We are present in Europe, but also beyond, in Africa and Asia and America. Yes, the theme comes timely, and we have to talk about it in a very open way. It is a very technical term, minimum energy performance standards. Let me bring this back down to the daily life. I think once in a lifetime, everybody is a tenant. Not everybody is born as an owner. And you are in a house that you can afford, and you go to your letterbox, and then you find a letter from your landlord telling you, Louise, your house will be renovated in a short time. There will be a lot of construction works, and of course, there are costs for me as a landlord. And Louise, unfortunately, you have to take a part of this cost for you too. So what is your impression then? I suppose not everybody will be happy to find such a letter in your mailbox. But on the other hand, perhaps you have been living in a house with leaking roofs, where you literally have the water in the kitchen dropping down. You may live in a house when you light up a candle, that the candle is blown out because your windows are so bad that the wind is blowing through. Then you also say as a tenant, yeah, we need to do something about it, because it is something, a situation that is also not healthy for me. Not talking about comfort, it's also not healthy for me. So I think this is a little bit the problem that we have to face. And one of the technical solutions, indeed, this is our theme of today, can be to implement minimum energy performance standards in housing. I think it is one of the steps necessary to go when we are careful. Why? You might see this poster on my back. And renovations now. Renovations is a technical term, an artificial term for what is going on currently in the housing sector. Eviction by renovation. Please be aware that the costs of renovation can be passed on to the end users, the residents of the house in 21 European member states by the rent law. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to talk about rent law, not only about minimum energy performance standards, renovation waves, affordable housing initiatives, new European Bauhaus, all what we have now here at European level, which is playing. And don't let me be misunderstood. It is very, very necessary that we talk about it. And we, the key stakeholders for affordable and social housing, we are very happy that we talk about it. But we have to be careful. Every investment ends up at the tenant. And how can we ensure, and this is what Anna just told before, how can we ensure that the people stay and that we do not end up with even more people on the street, not just by the pandemic, but also by renovations. And therefore, we have to talk solutions today. Therefore, I think we should talk about the standard of housing cost neutrality. Housing cost neutrality means that the rent increases are fully balanced by the energy savings. This sounds simple. It is simple, but it is not easy to achieve, because when you have a very high renovation standard, to achieve housing cost neutrality, of course, the cost of investment are extremely high. Those are passed on to the tenants, and then you end up with the rent increase in average of 30% more. Already on the, anyway, very high rent prices we have, 30% more. So how can you afford this? This is the worry that we have. And we do have some very good solutions. So also some technical solutions. If I explain it, it's too long for this panel, but I would like to invite you to take a look at the European Responsible Housing Initiative. I think the address will be displayed in our chat. There we can find very good big scale solutions on how to achieve housing cost neutrality in the sector by a perfect mix of public funding, EU funding, and big scale measures with, and now it comes, full tenants and residents participation. because they know where the roof is leaking, where the candle is blown out because of windows which leave the wind go through. So perhaps this is a start, and I'm happy to explain more in due time.
Thank you, Barbara. I think that's a really important point that you ended on, picking up as well from Anna there about the need to share these costs of the energy transition. It's a point we can make more broadly of renovation, but also of the energy transition fairly between the state, between tenants, and between landlords, and examples very welcome on how we achieve that. So thank you, Barbara. Moving now on to the perspective of the property owners and with Emmanuel, and of course, when we talk about property owners, it's not one type of organisation, and this is a key challenge. I wonder if you could outline kind of some of the key necessarily enablers for all these different types of building owners to ensure that they can achieve renovation successfully.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Barbara, for and Anna for your introductions. I think this was very interesting, and we can come back to some of these points a bit later. Just for the sake of clarification, our organization represent private property owners at large, so from homeowners, which is 70% of the population, to private landlords. So as you say, we represent a very wide range of the sector. So and for us, of course, we don't have a clear position on the MEPS, but what we consider is that we understand the objective of the measure, and we understand the need for the transition, and we know that our sector has a key role to play. But as Barbara rightly mentioned, we have some concern regarding the conception, the implementation, and the impact of the MEPS, being the economic and social impact of the MEPS for our sector. As we all know, the MEPS will have some positive impact, but also negative ones. And we don't have enough yet feedback on what this impact can be, even in the UK, basically, where the MEPS have been introduced since 2019, we don't have enough proper assessment yet. And as also both Barbara and Anna mentioned, the MEPS cannot be taken in isolation. There will be a whole set of measures coming in the Fit for 55 package that also will also impact the sector. And on top of that, of course, there is all national situation and also rental, housing, taxation law that also comes together when it comes to assessing the impact. So what it means for us is that we cannot rely on one solution across the board. And if we agree that we have a final destination, which is the decarbonisation of the stock by 2050, when the MEPS will be introduced, you need to be following a careful assessment, giving flexibility to member states, have a sectoral and progressive approach, and coupled with the right financial and the right safeguard in place. This is what I call the 6 pillars of a successful implementation of the MEPS. So to be sure that we mitigate this social but also economic impact on the property owners, because this, as the MEPS will have a cost for the society, will have a cost for the citizen, and we will have a cost for the real estate sector. So careful implementation or careful assessment, we hope, is what the Commission has done in the draft impact assessment. We will be looking at that later on, but we hope they will weight the measure against, of course, this possible impact socially and economic impact. So this will be the first step. Again, we will look at the impact assessment to see if it has been done. Another very important step for us is this national settings. Basically, the MEPS will, it's very unlikely that the MEPS will have a uniform impact between in different member states. It will have, it will also have a different impact depending on the sector, depending on the property archetype, and depending on the national and local markets. So these different settings need to be reflected, but also this national flexibility will be important because subsidiarity is key here. Barbara mentioned rental law and housing law are still national competencies, And this needs to be taken into consideration when you design the MEPS. And on top of that, I think national flexibility is also necessary, because different member states have chosen different paths when it comes to the decarbonisation of their stock. And the MEPS basically should not collide with this different path, but on the contrary, it should give some flexibility to encompass these different approaches into the measure. So this will be key. Flexibility, this will be decided later on in the legislative process, but it's a key element of the success of the MEPS. Another one is having, and this is probably even more important for us and for all of us around this table, it's a progressive approach. First, because it will take time to transpose the measure, maybe 2024 if we are lucky. And then we need the time to do as a sector, as a property owners, to do this work, this renovation. So we, especially when it comes to multi-apartment building, we might discuss this specific situation later on, but there, between the decision and the work, it takes up to 4-6 years before everything is accomplished. And this needs to be reflected in the measure. So we think that given the magnitude of the task, basically, setting any cutoff date before 2030 will be difficult. Also, I'm not mentioning here, but the EPC and the reliability of the EPC will be key. So this is also explain why we need this time to do the right implementation. Next to the right implementation and this progressive nature, we need also the chance to have a sectoral approach. Again, this will need to be decided later on in the legislative process. It might also be a link to subsidiarity. So, but we might think about having a different approach, for example, for residential and non-residential, public, private sector, and with a specific care for the housing sector, which will be, of course, where the most social impact are expected. So that's also an important aspect of the legislative process to come. Next to that, maybe one of the last aspects important for us is to have these specific safeguards. We need to avoid a blind implementation of the MEPS. We need to make sure that we don't push people into over-indebtedness. We need to make sure that we protect specific sectors such as, for example, the historical building sector, etc. So all this need to be reflected in the measure. To be done at EU or national level, this need to be seen, but this is an important element as well. And the last one, but maybe probably the most important one, and it's been mentioned by the others, especially when you talk about cost neutrality, when you talk about caring about the most vulnerable, you need to incentivize first before you impose, and we need to start now. So we need to put in place the right financial mean, the right technical assistance, and I mentioned one-stop shop. We know that the Commission is doing a lot. She also mentioned the climate action social facilities. We know that the RRF, for example, has given the possibility to member states to invest in the renovation of the building stock. But we also know that a lot of it is in the end of member states, and we have no guarantee that they will do something to assist the renovation and to incentivize it. And this is probably one of the most worrying aspects for us. And this needs to be also reflected in the ambition of the MEPS to make sure that we do not have too high ambition compared to what we can, how we can accompany the transition. And yeah, just to finally say again, we have a final destination, but we need to be realistic in the approach, and we need to make sure that this is done in a progressive way to mitigate this social impact. And I think this would be crucial, notably to avoid what Barbara mentioned as renovation. This will, the chance of renovation will be higher, the higher the standard will be. So basically that's it from my side.
Thank you, Manuel. Providing a useful focus, I think, there on the design of the MEPS itself, as much as then the safeguards and additional funding and enabling measures. Those two obviously need to go hand in hand and are equally important in terms of making sure that the renovation is successful. So finally, last but definitely not least, turning to Julian from Housing Europe. From obviously the social housing sector, we often look to the social housing sector for our inspiration for successful renovation models, excuse me, and obviously a sector that has, care for tenants, concerns about housing costs and affordability at the centre of its raison d'etre. So what are the specific concerns from your sector, Julien, and what can we learn from your sector more broadly for MEPS implementation?
Well, thank you, Louise, and thank you for the invitation to Housing Europe, which indeed we represent about 10% of the housing stock in Europe, and indeed we are in a sector where we see two things. First of all, we are kind of pioneering or leading on the transition to decarbonisation. If you look at the figures in terms of average energy performance and CO2 emissions per square meter, there's no doubt about that. And on the other hand, we are the sector where the low-income people are living. And therefore, we are the sector where we care most about affordability. So the fact that when you do a renovation, decarbonisation, you have to think about the financing of it. And the financing of it is usually a mix between different things. I mean, own capital, own funding, obviously, subsidies, loans, but also, in most of the cases, the contribution of tenants, either in the form of rent increase, indeed, or in the form of like monthly contribution to a fund that will help to do the renovation of the stock. What is the case in Denmark, for instance, and in Austria. And so the question is how you do this balancing act between doing the renovation, which is necessary, and on the other hand, maintaining affordability. So we indeed are guided by the cost neutrality principle that Barbara mentioned earlier. And it means that usually after renovation, the increase of the rent should not be higher than the decrease of the bill and on energy. The problem is usually energy savings are most always lower than what they were expected than the theoretical calculation. So we might end up in a situation where we have not really this complete cost neutrality. So energy efficiency investments is a challenge. I mean, we have to be honest about that. Minimum energy performance standards. And obviously, we want to be sure that the impact on affordability is really carefully measured. So it means that we need to look at, on the one hand, the cost of the intervention, also related to the cost of material, cost of capital, and on the other hand, the quantifiable positive impacts, but also negative impact, meaning rent increase, reduction of energy bills. We have put together, a bit like UIPI, a series of principle of tests or conditions that we believe would be important or necessary for MEPS to be implemented at EU level. I will not go through all of them now, but you'll find it, I'm sure, on the chat. I want to focus just on a couple of them, and not to repeat what Emmanuel and Barbara and Anna said. One of the things in particular which are very important for us is the question of the right timing, obviously. And the type of MEPS model that the European Commission has in mind. What we want to avoid is to have a very precise prescription of the model of MEPS at EU level. I mean, RAP has done a wonderful work in designing and compiling all the different models of MEPS around the world, and clearly we can't say that one of them works better than the other. So we need the Commission to remain as general and as flexible as possible in terms of what kind of model, whether it's basically getting rid of the worst performing segment of the stock, or whether it's bringing the whole stock to a certain average. I mean, we see plenty of options, and all of them are valid. So we want flexibility and a general approach at the European Commission level. The timing is important, as Emmanuel said. What we see in France, which have implemented one type of MEPS, is that they are now pushing back deadlines to get rid of certain energy classes, because they simply realize that, I mean, it's not realistic, it's not feasible, and it might have a really negative impact on affordability for tenants. So timing, flexibility, and the fact that we'll focus also on the ability of the construction sector to deliver. I mean, we should not underestimate the tremendous challenge for the construction sector to really deliver on I mean, this renovation wave that we were talking about, actually. And one important point as well is the fact that it might sound technical, but when you impose a renovation requirement, you have to be sure that you do it at the right moment in the life cycle of the buildings. I mean, issues like points of sales or rent doesn't make any sense for multifamily buildings. So we need to really look at the natural moments of the renovation cycle in a building, and that's why we need flexibility at your level and not over prescription. And last point I wanted to make is that, I mean, as you know, the historic mission of social housing is to provide affordable and decent homes for people for those in need. And we with an overprescription and forced renovation, we might run the risk of failing to fulfill this historic mission, because I mean, the sector will have to be extremely burdened on the side of renovation at the expense of providing new homes for the growing housing demand that we are seeing, in particular in relation to COVID. All this speaks for a very delicate approach, what we call a balancing act, and the Commission has to be aware of that, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation with you and all the stakeholders on that. So that's for the first shot for me.
Thank you very much, Ian. Once again, a huge amount there as a first shot. Something that all of you have mentioned is funding and finance. You know, inevitably, of course, it's one of the really key enablers. I would say actually to people listening, do use the Q&A to put questions to our panel. I have already a number of them in my head, so I'll carry on with those. But if you have questions, please do not hesitate to put them in the Q&A. But centering in on this question of funding and financing at the moment, I have many questions that I'd like to ask you. I think the first one, perhaps most centrally, is we are told, and I think a number of you focused on this slightly, that there are funds available for renovation. We certainly have recovery and resilience funding that can be used on renovation. We have a number of other kind of longer term EU funds that are available for renovation. Also, the private sector is telling us increasingly that it would like to spend money, you know, on climate proof projects, and buildings are obviously a key asset that the private sector does like to invest in. So one message we're receiving is that there's quite a lot of money around. But I think probably from all of our experiences, we're quite aware that there are certainly gaps, and there are and that we still have you know, money missing, and so I'd like to ask this question. Available in terms of funding and then separately finance, and what more do we need? What gaps are we needing to fill?
Thank you for your question. Well, yes, there is money in place. There is also EU money in place, but traditionally what we know, we are, especially us, we represent an ultra fragmented part of the sector. So a target for us is only very specific, very limited from EU funding. We never really had access to any of this, certainly not directly. So basically what we expect now for VRF is some of this fund will support national schemes. But even the national schemes, what we see, the problem is not necessarily the money being there or not being there. The problem is the scheme is too complicated. The scheme is not rightly made. You know very well how it is in the UK. I think you've done a very bad experience now with home grants. I don't remember exactly the name of the scheme, but we see as well other countries where the new scheme in place are generating lots of hopes, like the super bonus in Italy, or MaPrimeRénov' in France, but in the end it's not so easy, and also sometimes the scheme is too limited in the time to be accessible, for example, to multi-apartment building, as I said before, where the decision takes so long that at the end, when the decision is taken, the scheme is not in place there. So plus here I'm talking about funding because we consider that funding is what actually works. We did recently another survey among 10,000 property owners in Europe. A lot of them were homeowners, and we see that, for example, loan, because you were talking about private money coming into the sector, that loan is not attractive for homeowners, because a loan is something you need to repay, and it's the same for landlord, being public landlord or private landlord. In the end, it's also generating additional cost, and is not the let's say the element that will trigger the decision. So triggering the decision, it takes lots of aspect and lots of element to be in place, and money is one of them, but not the only one. Again, I'm insisting on the technical assistance and the way to help people to do the renovation, from accessing the funding to do the practical work. So that's for us the key aspect, and we hope that one-stop shop can be massified widely in Europe in order to support this transition.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Can I put the same question to you, Julian, obviously representing a different part of the property owners, perhaps particularly focusing on the funding aspect. Obviously, finance is only suitable, as Emmanuel has said, actually, only suitable for certain building types and to a certain extent. I'm quite clear that particularly for some of the most vulnerable households that obviously, are housed in social housing, many of them, public funding is going to be at least a part of the solution. So I wonder if you could comment there, Julian.
No, thank you. So first of all, just to be a bit provocative, yes, there's a say that indeed there's money out there, but actually we have to be very clear. Money only goes where there's profit. And in fact, energy efficiency investment, at least in the social housing sector, is far from being, let's say, profitable in the stricter sense of the word. So it's not really accurate to say there's money out there. We completely rely on the fact that the public sector, public money is invested in that area. And we were mentioning before in the role of the resilience and recovery facility. There will be, in theory, around 50 billion, so 50 billion euros dedicated to energy efficiency in buildings. But as Emmanuel said, first of all, it's not easy to reach out to a fragmented sector, which is private homeowners, but quite a few of this money will go to social housing. And actually, yeah, we need subsidies because energy efficiency, as far as we see it, does not pay for itself. So we made some calculation about around how much money we will need every year on top of the current investment to reach a decarbonisation by 2050, and this is around 60 bits. So it's a very low figure, very minimum, 16 billion every year for the next 30 years. So it's not something that you can really solve in one shot or relying on what the EU is doing. We need the member state to be really the main actor, the main player in that game, and so we really have to shift our thinking. And I know that some people, some MEPs were saying, yeah, there's money out there, we just need regulation and standards to direct and channel this. Actually, it's not accurate. I'm sorry to say that, but we need subsidies. Private money is not interested in investing in the renovation of social housing, because in part of it is, the reason of it is that, when you do energy renovation of social housing, you also do non-energy renovation. And you end up in a model which, by definition, is not looking for profit. So I think we have to be very careful not to fall into the trap of having easy slogans saying, yeah, money is there, we just need signals and standards. It doesn't work like this on the ground. So we need member states to realize that and to really, decide to do energy efficiency like an important mission for the state, and even have thinking of energy efficiency as a public mission, public service. And this would be probably a good way to avoid all the negative social impact of it.
Thank you, Julian. I see Barbara would like to come in on that question, but maybe I could add another question in at the same time, and Barbara, come directly to you, and I'd ask you to answer both if I could. So we have a question from Laura Peralta, and she says, do you envisage there's a risk of opportunistic behaviour from companies perhaps offering the finance, doing the work, doing the renovation works, and is there a way to make sure that this doesn't happen? Do we have any good experiences about ensuring that, you know, that this public service, this social good, actually that Julian was just referring to, actually becomes, you know, the central tenet of our renovation? Coming first to you, Barbara, and then Anna, if you have thoughts on either of those questions, but particularly the second one.
Yeah, thank you, Louise, and thank you, Julien and Emmanuel. You see that the entire sector has a little bit the same view on the problem, and I think this is proof that we need to do more than what we're currently doing. Let me name the elephant in the room, if I may so. The capitalization of funding. This is also what the question is, I think, pointing up to. We do all know that we have a very, very dangerous mix currently at the housing markets in Europe, but also beyond Europe. We have a massive shortage of affordable and social housing because we had a lack of investment in the sector. The European Commission said this lack of investment is 57 billion per year in the affordable housing sector. Then, on the other hand, we have a lot of money going on out there. Indeed, but it is mainly financed to home ownership. It is not directed to the rental housing sector. And there we have to be very, very careful. The Italian super bonus, when I first read that, I thought, well, that's a big step beyond. It is home ownership we are talking about. It is not for the rental housing sector. By the way, if you want to have a big screening of all the recovery and resilience plans of the countries, please address to my colleague Chiara Massarotto, who did the huge amount of work to screen all the plans, and there is nothing really substantially in for the rental housing sector. So there we have a lack. Let's name the second elephant in the room. When we impose MEPS, minimum energy performance standards, at a certain point there will be a ban on renting out worst performing buildings. They will vanish from the market. We do have this regulation already in one country, in Scotland. There, the housing standards are quite poor, and of course, the climate conditions are also not best. So there, it is not possible to rent out buildings with an energy performance certificate of E. So that is actually, at the first look, it's very good idea, because these are the buildings where tenants pay nearly the same amount for gas, heating and electricity than the basic rent that they pay. But on the other hand, where will these groups end up? You know, there is one iron rule at the housing market. It is from the Dutch grey eminence of the housing market screening, Professor Hugo Primus, Technical University of Delft. It says the iron rule of the housing market. Strong groups live in superior housing. Weak groups live in inferior housing. So what do we do with the weak groups? And I think the only way to do something, to make a first step, is perhaps not to ban to rent out these worst performing buildings, but set a rent freeze on it. It will not be allowed anymore to increase the rents in those buildings. That could be a first step, I think, a ban on rent increases. And then we see what's happening. And I particularly have in mind, of course, the private rental sector in the social and in the affordable housing sector, from the professional landlords, the institutional landlords. It's more, let's say, cost effective to have these big scale renovations at a good price for the private rental sector. And this is the sector who still, I think, Emmanuel, rents out 85% of all the rental housing in Europe. The situation is different. There we do have the problem of possible capitalization of funding. There we do have the problem of really extreme rent increases. And there I think we should really think about rent caps and a ban on rent increases. This should be directly come in attachment to minimum energy performance standards.
Thank you, Barbara. And finally to you, Anna, if I could remind you, because I know you do have good examples about this second question about ensuring that those who are offering the services, offering the renovations, offering the finance, the outcomes are good and no profiteering is seen. I know you have good examples for this, opportunity for you to share those.
Yes, there's one very good example that I can share, which is social rental intermediation that's already done to provide low-income households and most vulnerable groups affordable housing. And it's done through a social rental agency, which is a non-profit that comes in and creates a link between the landlord and the tenants, the vulnerable tenants, by guaranteeing the landlord that rent will be paid and there will be good maintenance of the property. And this model is also can also make use to prevent evictions. And we have an example in Flandern, for example, where we have a social rental agency called Bandjab, I hope I pronounce it right, is in Ghent, which is a cooperative with social purpose. And they take on empty property on a long lease, renovate it at no cost for the owner, and then rent it out to low-income households with a clause that these buildings then must be rented out to low-income households for 10 or 15 years. And maybe this could be really a model that can be promoted also from the Commission, and saying there can be a European social rental agency model. I think that would be a very suitable solution for those with lowest income that cannot afford to renovate otherwise.
Thank you very much, Anna, and I do agree with you. It's actually something that we've had in the UK for some time, not geared to green energy renovation, but actually just geared to bringing properties up into a decent standard from the private rented sector, but to be used as social housing. And so it's a model I know well, and it makes a lot of sense. We have a question here from Guillaume Joly. He asks, so funding is key in blending public and private sources. We've described this, but how would you see the trade-off between grants, de-risking tools, low interest loans, private investors, and the rest of the models, and how would it link to aggregation of projects to match and scale up the projects? Raise your hand if you'd like to take this question. It's a difficult one, I'd say, so I'm not going to point to someone. Julien.
I mean, as I said, this is on paper something that we've seen for many years, but in the social housing sector, it doesn't work like this. As I said, when you do renovation, you have a mix of on funding from the social housing company, bank loans, loans related to energy investments. So it's usually conditioned to the realization of certain outcomes, and the contribution of tenants. So you don't have something like private investor de-risking tools. That's not something that we see very. Actually, I've not seen that in the social housing sector, and we've reviewed and we've compared the financing of social housing in many countries. So it might be interesting in some co-ownership structure probably, but Emmanuel might know more about that, but this is not something that we see very much in the social housing sector. So I know it's something we say on paper at EU level, but it's not something that it doesn't work like this in reality, I'm afraid.
Emmanuel, do you want to come in? We have one more minute unfortunately, only one more minute before we move on and look to the reflections on national experiences. I think there's a lot here to reflect on. Is there a last comment, Emmanuel, on that point?
No, well, not much. I think this is not very valid as well for homeownership and let's say the small private landlords. This might be more valid for larger investors, I think, sector. And And again, I would like to stress what Barbara just said about the worst performing stock and the risk of this stock to leave the market. And this is a real risk, or even this stock to go underground and be on the black market. There can be some of them. It's not going to be a general trend, but still. So we need to, in order to avoid that, I just would like to come back to what Anna mentioned. This social rental agency is a good model indeed to avoid that some of these worst performing building that cannot be renovated because the owners doesn't have either the funding to do so, or because it doesn't have the let's say the capacity or just the willingness to do so and to manage his properties anymore, and prefer just to leave them vacant, then this social rental agency is a good solution. But again, it's a niche, and it's not a solution for everything. And I would like to take this as maybe a final comments that we are talking about one extremely fragmented sector with a lot of actors in place, a lot of stakeholders that will have an impact on the renovation, and we need to be very careful in what we do because of that, because we cannot have one single solution, and this needs to be reflected in the way we design the MEPS.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Really important point to end on, both in the design of the MEPS and actually in these enabling, supporting policies. This granularity of the sector. It has always been our challenge for those of us working in renovation, of course, hasn't it? Is that it is one of the most fragmented sectors. Buildings, are everywhere with different uses, different types of buildings, different ownership. So it's always been our renovation challenge. But I think what we're really hearing about the measures around a MEPS is that it is about integration, really. I think Barbara made this point really early, but it's about integration into broader housing strategies around sustainable housing, security supply, affordable housing, affordability of housing. So that for me is a key takeaway. With so much now already covered by this panel, I will say thank you to this panel and introduce the next panel, who will provide us with some insights from their own contexts on these questions. I would also invite them to respond to any points that have been made. I know France has been mentioned a couple of times, and we have Daniel Dubrow from Clarion France with us today, so I would encourage the panelists to reflect on what they've already heard. But I am delighted to introduce now our second panel. We have Daniel Dubrow of CLAIR, the network of French organisations committed to the energy transition. And we have Javier Tobias of ECODES, the Ecology and Development Foundation, working in Spain and beyond. We have Thomas Engelke of the Foundation of German Consumer Organisations. And finally, Dragomir Zanev of ENEFECT, which is the Bulgarian Centre for Energy Efficiency. Welcome all. First of all, turning to you, Danielle, clearly, as we've already heard, France has introduced a number of types of MEPS already. We've had a couple of comments about the effectiveness or the process of rolling those out. Wonder if you could give us your perspective on the MEPS that are addressed to housing, and then also we do recognise that France is a country that's been aware of and as have measures for addressing energy poverty now for some time. So if you could also outline to us some of the measures, the support for renovation in France, particularly for low-income households.
I'll try to do that in 5 minutes. Thank you, Louise, and thank you everyone to attend this webinar. So first I will just drop 2 numbers. So in France, we have 5 to 7 million leaky housing and 8 to 12 million people living in fuel poverty, depending on the estimation. And that is also a big problem among all of what we are talking. And it's a real situation in every country in Europe. What important MEPS are in place in France, and I will only speak about the ones that are directly that have direct impact on the situation of low-income households, because there are others. So I would start from the thermal regulation of existing buildings, so residential buildings, which is the sweeping car of the regulation. It serves only to eliminate the least efficient equipment from the market, It's an element by element approach, which is very different from the global performance approach used in the thermal regulation for new buildings. The consequence of that, so I'll skip up the methodological problem and the need for methodological harmonization between these two thermal regulation, which is also a problem. But the direct impact in terms of public subsidies is that the most of the public subsidies scheme are based on elements. So in France, we have two possible ways of public subsidies whose amounts are bonified for the modest household. So my renovation bonus, mentioned as MaPrimeRénov', and the energy savings certificates, so the white certificate scheme. Both of them are bonified for modest households. So modest households can be considered as few model households. It's very much easier to work like that. But there is very limited incitation to engage modest households to choose a global and performance situation. So the conclusion is the impacts of the public policies to reduce the energy poverty through renovation subsidies are very limited, except on one program held by the National Agency for the Improvement of Housing, dedicated to few poor households since the start of it. So that's early 2010, 11 or 12, I don't remember exactly, which is a global approach, but not performant enough. So this brings comfort progress, but will have limited impact on the decrease of the energy bills. So that's the limit. And the assistance and counseling scheme for these households in fuel poverty through home improvement is insufficient. It's limited to about 10 hours per household. That is not only the question to have an assistance scheme, is to have the right assistance scheme to fit it for the right situation. And it can be different between the situation from modest households to normal income households, we can say, or middle income households. So that's what's in place actually. What is being discussed now in the framework of the climate and resilience law, which is still under discussion in France, and it's following the citizen convention climate, which I will go back to that later, so very soon. So, but the regulatory maturity, so the state of maturity of this discussion allows us to project this discussion into reality at a very short horizon, so between now and 2025. So the biggest point I want to talk about is the decency standards. So in France, since the late 80s, we have a decency standards that is conditioning the possibility to rent a house or a flat in France. And since a few years now, more than 10 years, we fought for the implementation of an energy performance criteria in the decency standards in France. So now we have we succeed in this long-lasting demand. So two successive bills have set a target in terms of EPC level for rented for the authorization of a rented flat, which is both a step forward and at the same time is far away from the long-term objectives. So the ban so from 2023 there will be a ban on increase of rental fee for F and G classes rented housing, and there will be a ban on renting out G homes in 2025 and F homes in 2028. So that will concern between 2 and 3 million homes. So that's large. So more than the half of these rented dwellings are occupied by fuel poor households actually. So it's a direct have a direct consequence on them. So we have to maximize the benefit of it. And I want to add that more than 70% of these leaky house on the rental market are owned by landlords with incomes between the 8th and 10th deciles. So that's also a data we have to have in mind. So the number of affected dwellings remain sufficient fraction of the total leaky housing stock. The rental ban is not coupled with an obligation to reach a minimum target in EPC level after renovation, which means that for the moment we can also foresee an improvement in comfort for the tenants, but a limited impact on the decrease of energy bill. So probably insufficient to get out of fuel poverty. Nevertheless, if this logic is followed, there will be a clear improvement in the comfort conditions of the dwellings for households in fuel poverty who are very overrepresented in rented dwellings in France. But it will be necessary to ensure that in exchange for the public subsidies, because landlords in France are already the most helped, financially helped by different schemes, tax credits, and so direct subsidies. And now from the 1st of July, they're now eligible to the my renovation bonus or my prime rénov. So they are eligible to all kind of help in France, and it's not conditioned to achieve a certain EPC band. So that's a kind of a gift, we can say. And the conditions in exchange for the public subsidy is that we have to guarantee that renovated dwellings is maintained in the market, or the people that are living in these renovated dwellings are maintained in their house, and as well as the rental price, as Barbara said. Very, very important to make these conditions. So I could speak about another MEPS we are trying to implement, but I will not because I have no time. So the conditional obligation to renovate. So this is a lost fight for the moment. So I will go over that. I just wanted to add that the fact that the debate was focused on something very, very ambitious in the Citizens' Climate Convention on logic allowed us to go further in the discussions with the MPs that we thought, because the society push was really, really strong. So we conclude that it's better to put forward the most ambitious proposal possible, especially in the case where there are other citizens' convention on climate in Europe. We need to invest these spaces to confer democratic legitimacy on MEPS beyond their economic and climate and health legitimacy. And the focus should be on the social acceptability of this type of measure, and particularly on making people understand the general interest, specifically the landlords. The benefits will be for everybody, and the more the measure is understand and accepted, if the point related to financial support and assistance are strong, as well as the guarantee of results, and so the performance is pushed to make subsequent impacts directly related to the energy bills. Sorry.
No, thank you, Daniel. I mean, clearly 5 minutes is not enough to cover the entire experience that we've had in France. I think, I mean, it's making me think we could have a whole webinar. Actually, would be very interesting to just learn from this experience you've had in France. Really important points you're raising there about linking funds to energy performance, but also around, you know, subsidies don't necessarily reach the low-income households, even if they are eligible for them. And I think that's definitely something we've learned from the UK as well. It'd be really interesting actually to have an exchange between the experience with MEPS and the relevant support programs for renovation between France and the UK as well, actually. But we don't have time for that today, unfortunately, but thank you very much for that swift overview. Now turning to Javier Tobias from ECODES. So I know, Javier, you and I have been working together, so I know you've been doing a stakeholder consultation process on the introduction of MEPS in Spain. Perhaps you could share with us some of the findings.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. I'll try to be pretty brief. Yeah, regarding that process with the stakeholders, yesterday we held, due to part of it, a webinar regarding MEPS in Spain, and with several of these stakeholders and policy makers. And one of the policymakers pointed out an interesting, or reminded us of something interesting, that in Spain in 2013, a decree was passed which stated that by the end of 2017, all existing residential buildings should be accessible for people on wheelchairs, etc. Just have that in mind next time you go through Spain. Basically, it hasn't been implemented at all, almost. So it just points out what has already been said around the whole session, that communication campaigns, economic incentives, and focusing on the inspection are key to implement a measure such as MEPS. Just having the policy or the regulatory framework is not enough. The particularities of Spain that have been seen by the stakeholders and that we already know of is that there is a lot of multi-family buildings. 2/3 of the population live in multi-family buildings, which have also a property structure that's quite atomized. So in here, any renovation process can be slowed down by at least half a year just by reaching agreements, consensus with the community of owners. Taking that into consideration, most of the stakeholders here in Spain consider that renovations should be targeted at a whole area scale, not just a building, but basically whole neighborhoods, to push down that negotiation process, to open it up, and just think that if we're going to have to spend half a year or 1 year negotiating with a lot of owners, just make the process even bigger and focus on buildings that have similar conditions and that can be a use of the resources that is much more effective and more efficient. Also, you can target vulnerable neighborhoods that way, because in Spain in particular, there are several neighborhoods built around the 1960s, 1970s, which have very similar conditions and that have been abandoned progressively by the original population and have been turning more and more vulnerable. So targeting those kind of neighborhoods would be a quite efficient way of kickstarting the whole renovation wave with a lot of public funding and a lot of public technical aid. Also, just on another note, we are currently in Spain in the public consultation process of the framework that is going to regulate the whole building renovation incentives. And there are several things that we can bring to the table and that we agree with, or that we see that are missing and have to be pushed upon if we want to push a measure like MEPS. Currently, this framework states that 30% of the incentives of the 1.1 billion that are going to be facilitated throughout the next year have to be focused on what is called residential areas for scheduled renovation. So basically, neighborhood renovation, which is we think that is a step in the right direction. But also at the same time, they are stating no social safeguards regarding rent prices going up, which we think is a key statement. Many of the participants today have been talking about that, and also they maintain that this regulatory framework maintains that the person that is receiving the incentive still has to pay some of the fees, some of the taxes related to the renovation project, which is something that, particularly for vulnerable population, is already a barrier high enough not to allow them to take part in this project. So even if you are subsidizing 100% of the project, but people still have to pay fees and taxes of those projects, it's still going to leave them out of that. And then just lastly, not to overdo it, from the Spanish context, there's also something that has been pointed out by many of the stakeholders, that is the importance in the measure that we use regarding MEPS, that here in particular in the south of Spain and the Canary Islands, we have building regulations that come at a national level and a European level, and that they go over the singularities that they face through heating and so on. So a lot of the regulation is currently focused on cooling, on heating savings, but not so much on cooling savings. And sometimes they are obliged to implement some heating systems which are not required, or to renovate their homes in a way that makes them even worse. So just those few points that I'll be happy to go more into detail during the roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. Absolutely, very interesting points. I think on this neighbourhood approach, particularly relevant, as you say, where multifamily buildings have many stakeholders to be brought into line. I think MEPS do have the potential to align the interests of multifamily building stakeholders, but as you say, needing this more coordinated approach, possibly across a region. So that's a really interesting example. Thank you. Moving now on to Thomas from the German perspective. I mean, we do often look to Germany as one of the countries I think that probably has had maybe the most complete renovation support framework. You might tell me I'm wrong there, but I think that's the impression we have. But also very interestingly in the context of Germany is that I understand more than 50% of German households are tenants. So I'd really be interested in your reflections there, perhaps picking up on some of the points that Barbara made earlier as well. So Tom.
Okay, thank you, Louise, for your kind introduction and your invitation to this event, giving me the opportunity to give you some insight to the consumer's point of view on MEPS. After, say, several years of absence in Germany, the issue of energy efficiency is back on the German agenda, and also now to the also on the European agenda, what is excellent. There is a high dimension for consumers in the issue of building and energy efficiency, as we have in Germany, we have 22 million buildings, out of which 19 million buildings are residential. And out of these, again, are 3.2 million apartment buildings and 15.8 million one-family or two-family houses. And of course, in the one-family and the two-family houses, the consumers can decide themselves what they do, what they invest, how far they go. And in the apartment buildings, it's the owner, and it's of course not the tenants. And of course, there is, and we need a special focus on tenants, as they represent, as you already mentioned, more than half of the consumers in Germany. I think in Europe, only Switzerland even have more tenants. So in addition to that, it's important to know that more than half of the German building stock was built before the first German Thermal Insulation Act of 1978. So that is more than 40 years ago. Therefore, this part of the stock has a particular high energy consumption. And looking on the other side at the renovation rate of the building stock in Germany, we still see a rate of 1%, some say 1.5%, and it's low and it is not changing. Even there are a lot of measures, there's a lot of money, a lot of programs, but it is not enough to change this rate until now. So far, in Germany, we do not have an obligation for MEPS, although we have a lot of financial support schemes in place. But now, say in the last months, we have a promising discussion on this issue, and this discussion includes, thanks God, also the federal government. So how can this situation be improved? The Federation of German Consumer Organizations developed, together with other organizations, the concept of demand and promote, which means the combination of two issues. First, the raising of energy efficiency standards for new buildings and the building stocks, which is, I mean, not so easy to come forward as a consumer organization, because you give this obligation to your own people, say. So raising the energy efficiency standards, and at the same time safeguarding an extensive public financial support on national and European level. And in particular, of course, to low-income households, but not only, but in the end to all households. And Louise, I just sent you the corresponding link to the paper. So what does that mean for minimum energy performance standards? Let me give you a number of points which are important from the view of my organization. We support MEPS as such, and we also support to introduce MEPS for the energetically poorest residential buildings, both for the rented stock and the owner-occupied property. This is where the highest energy costs are incurred for consumers and where the biggest energy potential must be exploited. Then high energy efficiency standards are supported by my organization, and the worst buildings should be approached first. Then a deep renovation in one step would be a priority because it's the most economical approach, meaning touch once until 2050. We have concerns about the CO2 indicators because they can be counterproductive to the implementation of energy efficiency. We all know that the availability of renewables is very limited, so energy efficiency and renewables should complement and not exclude each other. And one final remark, the broad implementation of MEPS will cost a lot of money. This will only work if there is sufficient financial support from the government, meaning as a priority from the national government to the house owners. And at the same time, tenants have to be protected against rent increases. I refer to the word renovation that was introduced by Barbara in the first panel this morning. I like that. Therefore, the so-called modernization levy that can be transferred from the house owner to the tenant must be provided with a cap to a very low level, maybe even to zero. If the house owner receives public money for the renovation, then in any case, the modernization levy should be zero. So up to now, we have no concrete solutions implementing MEPS in Germany. However, I think from a consumer's point of view, MEPS could play a central role in achieving a climate neutral building stocks until 2050, if they go hand in hand with sufficient financial support for the house owners, as well as a sufficient protection measures for the tenants. Thank you.
Thomas, that's wonderful, beautifully summarised at the end there, and also really interested to hear you talking about a deep renovation standard. I think that's, as Danielle says, as proposed also by the French Citizens Convention on Climate. Very interesting to hear you say that, but also to hear the thinking you've done at a national level about the relevant changes to specific laws around the modernisation levy, around conditionality associated with public funding. This is, I think, exactly the kind of thinking that obviously needs to be done at national level, but we can amplify and share with other countries to illustrate how this can be done in a safe way. So thank you very much for all of that, and thank you for all of your thinking, and really interested to hear how the conversations continue in Germany. Dragomir, finally to you, last but not least, I'd love to hear your response to a proposal for minimum energy performance standards in Bulgaria. And perhaps also, I know you've been doing some work on multifamily buildings, renovation and financing that. I'd really like to hear a little bit more about your work.
Thanks a lot, Wiz. Good morning to everybody, and thanks again for the invitation and the chance to be able to conclude this very informative and useful session, I would think. I'm actually not going to be able to chip in meaningfully into the discussion regarding the rental market because of the specific of the Bulgarian building stock, which is predominantly owner-occupied. But still, that doesn't make it any easier, especially regarding the multifamily buildings, where at the end of the day, we have each apartment, each dwelling owned by a different individual, and that needs a lot of coordination. I'm really happy to see that actually in all presentations, MEPS are taken or discussed as part of the broader regulatory and political framework and social framework, I would say. And in that regard, so taking in mind the situation in Bulgaria, actually, I very often resort to a paragraph, 3 sentences from a certain RAP report that we should know particularly well. And I guess I cannot put it any better. I'll just read it aloud. So in that report, it is stated that MEPS signal the destination for the whole building stock and the individual buildings, which helps align the demand and the supply chains and provide space for business and social innovation. They can also drive the take-up of existing funding, finance, and incentives, improving in general the renovation program. And as also Emmanuel has said, even in countries that have generous and coherent programs of assistance, funds are not being dispersed quickly enough, which suggests that there are further measures that need to drive the demand. And I can tell you that there's a lot of truth in that statement. So we had that in Bulgaria firsthand. So believe it or not, even at a 100% grant rate for renovation of multifamily residential buildings, the uptake was slow and burdensome. And what's worse, it gave the wrong signals. It gave the signals that actually the state is responsible for the maintenance of the privately owned building, and that there's practically no business in that area, and that's completely destructive. It is not a part of a long-term roadmap. And unfortunately, the case is that is still not, but there are some good signs that we'll be talking about later. Well, MEPS actually have the potential to put that right. And we do stick high expectations to them, but yet again, a broader policy transformation is needed, which should target increased scope, depth, and sustainability in general of the renovation process. So 2 words about the current situation. In Bulgaria, we have the requirements to renovate the buildings to energy class C, and for renovation for residential buildings, that would mean up to 240 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And that's for primary energy for the full use of the building, but that's obviously not particularly ambitious. As mentioned, that kind of whole building renovation is usually done with the support of the national financing programs, fully funded by public sources. At the same time, we have the renovation strategy since 2016 that states that we should go to energy class B. We have the calculations for cost optimality in the new long-term renovation strategy, a pretty good one, and I will say a little bit about that later on, that say that the cost optimal levels are up to energy class A. And that means basically a potential of up to 80% of energy savings from compared to the current consumption, a huge one. However, we still lack the intent to bring in the change. So for example, our NZEP definition, while it exists since 2015, it's not applied in practice yet. And the obligation to have building passports for the existing buildings, multifamily and not only, was postponed once in 2014. Then it was postponed now, the deadline was 2022, and we'll see what happened in 2024. And that's the vehicle to bring forward that kind of instruments as the minimal energy performance requirement. So in the past 10 years, we've been communicating about a change coming around 2020, but now the question is, where's the change? What kind of change? So we need a huge problem to tackle. And yeah, based on deployment of the right instrument, now we have the unique opportunity through the Green Deal, the Recovery and Resilience Mechanism, to make the transformation, to make the change. We have, as I mentioned, huge potential hidden in these 80% of savings. We have huge potential hidden in the capacity of the private owners to invest in their own properties with 35 billion euros, something hidden in the bank deposits. And we also have the capacity to use the sustained or increased price on the real estate market of these properties. But the solutions are very, very social and politically demanding, and they need a very strong coordination. They need sufficient set of financing instruments, and this financing instrument should also take into account the energy poverty problem that has been identified many times previously in this webinar. We need professional management. We need investment in knowledge and education, particularly important, and we need communication with the private homeowners, with the end users, with the citizens. Actually, at the end, we have the long-term renovation strategy, putting all these components together and adding important instruments as calculation methodology, as reliable tools for assessment of the building performance, as ambition for electronic register of the building combined with the digital building logbooks, components for technical assistance. That's all really nice, and that's really commendable in the long-term renovation strategy that we have, and I trust it's a good example. But if we are to make a difference, we should always remember effective monitoring and review of the policies, and forms of compliance, assessment of the quality of the renovation is crucial. And we should really make sure that happens, as otherwise we could again see good intentions go into thin air, and not only on national and EU level as well. So thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer to any questions.
Thank you, Dragomir. That was a brilliant presentation to end on, actually, full of passion and of very solid ideas about exactly what we need, outlining this complete framework that you're talking about. We are running a little late, and so I will just, if we may, end with two questions. One specific question coming from the chat about multifamily buildings that I'll pose to Javier and Dragomir, if I may. And then I'd really like to join the two panels up in some way to end, so that the second question I will ask, and if everyone could be having a little think about it, is that from your national perspectives, thinking back to the topic of the first panel, which is what do we need at EU level? What are the most important things? I mean, Dragomir, you've mentioned a lot of them, but really, what are your priorities in this Fit for 55 package and beyond? What do you fundamentally need from the EU level? And what are you quite happy that will be generated nationally and is appropriate to be generated nationally? So first of all, to Javier and Dragomir, swift answers, if you may. And the question is from Henning Ellerman around the role of MEPS in overcoming some of the barriers in multifamily buildings. He suggests that MEPS might be useful to avoid most of the usual negotiations in multi-owner apartment buildings. And just really for your reflections briefly on that subject.
Yes, I think that they will, but again, as I stated, on 2013, we had a decree here in Spain that obliged buildings to be accessible, and still most of them aren't. So just MEPS by themselves are not enough. They help, but they're not enough. Incentives, and also from the Spanish standpoint, continued over time, because as the negotiation takes a lot of time, you have to have several years of the same funding or the same programs so people can apply for them. So both of long-term programs and MEPS can really help in this business.
Thank you. And Dragomir, do you have anything to add there?
I couldn't agree more. So MEPS should be a part of a system of incentives and penalties, and they should be combined with a clear roadmap for gradual introduction of the system of penalties. And they should be also combined with a very intensive national and local level communication campaign. That's the key to understand why it is needed to impose such restriction and what benefits the proactive behavior would bring to the homeowners and to the residents. So basically, these are some of the key components of the system that we have to maintain.
Thank you very much. So finally, on to this next question then, briefly, if I could ask you just in a minute or less each to summarize what the key things you would like to see from the EU level alongside MEPS. I mean, obviously our conversation's gone into much more the broad renovation framework, but particularly focusing on making sure that the social benefits come from MEPS and we don't see any negative unintended consequences. Daniel, would you like to go first? You are first on my screen.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to answer the question and also to link it to the capacities of the sector in order to fulfill or to achieve the future and inevitable MEPS that will be implemented. So one of the questions that we have to take into account at the EU level is the huge amount of work to do and the capacities and the large possibilities of employment or jobs that are carried by this MEPS and it cannot be an excuse not to do things. It has to be considered as a criteria to work on and to be fully accompanied at EU and national level and local level also in order to make it possible and to make it concretely possible in terms of performance achievement. And so because the performance level of the work is the very strong condition of delivering social and climate and health impacts. And if you don't do that, you don't deliver as much as you can in this all broad of benefits, range of benefits, all kind of benefits. But one of the most questions we have to ask and we have to go over is the role of the different political level in order to make the sector, the response of the professional sector possible and at the level we are expecting them. So that would be my last word.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I will apologise, we're already slightly over time, but if those can stay, please do, and we will wrap up just taking 5 minutes over time. Interesting final comment there from Daniel, pointing, of course, to the need for political leadership, which I don't think we can echo loudly enough at the moment. Javier, the last couple of points from you.
Yeah, I think that we should prioritize having guidelines for those social safeguards, also adding legitimacy to them. For example, in Catalonia, a region in Spain, a regional decree was passed regarding rental limits, which is being heavily questioned by the national government. I think that if there was more support and more guidelines for this kind of measures from a European level, they could be applied, and they are of key importance in the tenant landowner dichotomy that we're having regarding MEPS.
Thank you, Javier. Thomas, your final thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, I try to make it short. So besides the MEPS and of course public financial support, I think we also need a very clear definition of the nearly zero energy building standard. And second, from the consumer's point of view, we need transparency for consumers concerning, in particular, the energy performance certificate for every building and the building renovation passport. Thanks.
Thank you. And Dragomir, finally to you.
Well, political leadership which transfers in long-term predictability, transparency, and continuity in policy, which then relates or transfers to a clear public message or intensively broadcasted message which drives and shapes investment decisions in the long term. So yeah, that would be in one sentence.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that beautifully concise one sentence description. I am not going to attempt, particularly as we're over time, to summarize everything that we've covered today. It has been hugely rich. We have been recording this session and we'll go back and go through with a fine-tooth comb to bring out all of the useful ideas. I think the things I've just taken away, there are, this idea, this issue of needing to provide social safeguards is not a niche one. We heard some huge figures at the beginning of the first panel, actually, about the numbers of buildings, the number of households that do have barriers to renovation and that are vulnerable. And therefore, it's very clear to me now that the social safeguards are an intrinsic part of delivering MEPS for actually probably the majority of buildings. And so, we really must make sure that the entire Fit for 55 package, the piece we're expecting next week, and then the pieces we're expecting following that, need to work towards this commitment from the Commission to alleviate energy poverty this decade and deliver a fair, inclusive transition, and not just, as was mentioned earlier, mitigate the distributional impacts. We really need to look at these the climate, environmental goals and the social goals hand in hand. And the other thing I'm hearing as well is I think there is a lot of support for minimum energy performance standards, particularly in this panel. I'm hearing very clearly that at member state level, I think you've all said that these are needed. So that's very encouraging, and I think that's a clear political message as well to take away in light of this need for leadership. So I will not continue to talk. I will just end by saying a huge thanks to our speakers. If our early panelists are still on, please put on your cameras so I can just say thanks to you face to face. So huge thanks to our speakers. Huge thanks also to ECF for taking the initiative of putting this webinar together and inviting me to facilitate it. Thanks also to Rudd Peterson, Dominica and Joanna for your support throughout. And of course to all the participants for your comments and your questions. And this will not be the end of this conversation. There is a lot more work to do here, but this has been a wonderful start to the conversation. So thank you all very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day.